Hello, welcome back to the Dixie Belle YouTube channel. I'm Connie and I'm one of your Dixie Belle brand ambassadors. I'm going to upcycle this stool today and it's partially sanded because my mum actually got me this from a charity shop and I really like the shape of it, but I didn't really know what to do with it until Dixie Belle sent me this brand new stencil design and I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. So as you can see, I did start sanding the dark varnish off this piece. So I already cleaned it with Dixie Belle's White Lightning before I sanded, and then it basically stayed in the corner of my workshop for a while. Like I say, I didn't know what to do with it, and then as soon as I got this stencil in my hand, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. So I just sanded away at the dark varnish. It was pretty tough. Luckily my electric sander did do most of the work for me, but I did have to hand sand some of the detail in between the leg spindles and where the legs join the top as well. And then once it had been completely stripped of the dark varnish, I used a Dixie Belle sanding sponge just to make sure there were no harsh edges or sharp bits. That's just going to make it nice and smooth and buttery soft. And then the last thing I did is just gave it a wipe down because any dust that's on the surface of that stool will get trapped in my paint, which will give a really uneven finish if you don't remove that dust first. I also taped off the lip around the edge of the stool just because I want to concentrate the stencil design on the very centre of the stool. So the colour that I'm going to use with the stencil is Caviar. This is Dixie Belle's Pure Black from their chalk mineral paint range. I'm going to pour some out onto a paper plate and I'm using Best Dang brush. The reason I pour some out onto a paper plate is because you get a nice even distribution of paint on your bristles without having way too much product. And the key is with stenciling is to take off as much paint as you possibly can onto a rag before you apply your stencil. This stencil is quite delicate. There's quite a lot of little sort of leafy parts to it. So in order to keep it stuck down, because my stool does have a sort of concave bit in the centre, I'm going to use a spray adhesive. This is a low tack spray adhesive. And what it's going to do is just keep the stencil flat on the surface while I'm stenciling without the risk of any parts kind of lifting up. I've got a little bit there that I didn't put any spray adhesive on, so I'm going to start with that and I'm going to use my left hand to hold the stencil down in place. The key with stenciling is to keep your stencil as close or as flat to the surface that you're stenciling as you physically can and use a very, very small amount of paint on your brush. Now you can either do a swirling motion over the top of your stencil or you can do a pouncing motion over the top of your stencil. Both work. I alternate between both and it really depends on the type of stencil that I'm using. As I said before, this is a fairly delicate stencil, so the pouncing version is going to be slightly better for this because it's not going to risk any bleed through happening with the paint. And bleed through is when your paint seeps underneath your stencil and basically gives you a sort of blurred edge or not a very crisp line. So as you can see, I'm showing you this in real time. I'm not speeding this up at all and I'm just working really slowly around the stencil. I am stopping to apply a little bit more product onto my brush. This is the Best Dang brush. I'm not sure if I mentioned that previously, but the reason I like this brush is because it's a natural bristle brush, which really does help with stenciling because it helps absorb some of the product into the natural bristles, and also it's got a really nice flat surface, which is great for stenciling as well. So as you can see, I'm just dabbing a tiny bit more of the Caviar onto my brush, rubbing it off onto the rag again, and then just working my way around the stool until I've completed it all. So black paint covers fairly well. I'm lucky that this is going to cover in one coat. However, if you do need to do a second coat for coverage on your stencil, I'd highly advise either blasting the area dry without moving the stencil and then reapplying, or just letting it dry naturally as it is and leave the stencil in place if possible, because if you lift the stencil and try to put it back down in the same place, it's going to be more difficult because you're going to get movement and you might not line it up properly, and again that can obviously give you kind of blurred lines or not like a crisp finish. So I would personally do it that way. There are loads of different methods to stenciling, but that's just personally the way I would do it if you did need to do 2 coats. But as I mentioned, this is going to be just a 1 coat job. So once it's completely covered and I'm happy with the coverage, then I lifted the stencil off, and then I can take the masking tape off, and then I'm just going to let the stencil completely dry. Now I'm going over the top of raw wood. The stool is obviously raw wood, so it dried pretty quickly. And then what I'm going to do, just to make this super smooth, because I also want like a kind of a vintage kind of look for this stool, is I'm just going to really lightly sand the top of the stencil once it's completely dry with a Dixie Belle sanding sponge. This is just going to kind of soften the look. I'm also going to concentrate around the edges, just to kind of give it like a faded look, to give the impression that the pattern's a little bit faded around the edge. Just like I say, because I kind of want a little bit more of a vintage effect for this stool. And then to finish off, I'm just going to use Best Down Wax in brown with the La Petite brush, just to give this a really nice richness. I think black and brown work really well together, and obviously I did previously strip this of its dark varnish, but it was super dark and it was also a little bit dated because it was really shiny. Wax is going to give me a really nice beautiful sheen, and it just adds a little bit more richness and depth to the piece, because you can still see the wood grain through it, as opposed to that dark varnish being a completely kind of full coverage dark varnish, if that makes any sense at all. And then once the wax had been on there for about half an hour, I just buffed it off with a shop cloth, which is going to give you that nice shine and remove any excess product. Here's a little close-up of what the stool looked like. It finished up as a bedside table actually in my house, and I'm keeping it. Thank you for watching the short video. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, if you want to check out any of the products that I've used in today's video or any other Dixie Belle products, please check out your local retailer and support those guys. And I look forward to see what you create with this brand new stencil. See you next time. Bye.